yes, one will be able to find some form of communication, whatever communication means. Communication requires notions of purpose and things like this. It's a kind of philosophical quagmire.
So if AI is a kind of alien life form, what do you think visiting looks like? So if we look at aliens visiting, and we'll get to discuss computation and the world of computation, but if you were to imagine, you said you already prejudiced something by saying you visit, but how would aliens visit?
By visit, there's kind of an implication, and here we're using the imprecision of human language, in a world of the future, if that's represented in computational language, we might be able to take the concept visit and go look in the documentation basically and find out exactly what does that mean, what properties does it have, and so on. But by visit in ordinary human language, I'm kind of taking it to be there's, something, a physical embodiment that shows up in a spacecraft, since photons in some very elaborate pattern. We're imagining it's physical things made of atoms and so on that show up.
Can it be photons in a pattern?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, whether there is the possibility, what counts as intelligence? Good question. I mean,
Yes.
It's, and I used to think there was sort of there'll be, it'll be clear what it means to find extraterrestrial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've increasingly realized as a result of science that I've done that there really isn't a bright line between the intelligent and the merely computational, so to speak. So, in our kind of everyday sort of discussion, we'll say things like, the weather has a mind of its own. Well, let's unpack that question. We realize that there are computational processes that go on that determine the fluid dynamics of this and that in the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do we distinguish that from the processes that go on in our brains of, the physical processes that go on in our brains? How do we separate those? How do we say the physical processes going on that represent sophisticated computations in the weather? Oh, that's not the same as the physical processes that go on that represent sophisticated computations in our brains. The answer is I don't think there is a fundamental distinction. I think the distinction for us is that there's kind of a thread of history and so on that connects kind of what happens in different brains to each other, so to speak. And it's what happens in the weather is something which is not connected by sort of a thread of civilizational history, so to speak, to what we're used to.
In the stories that the human brains told us, but